Before we go into more detail on arrays, let's spend a little bit more time looking at programs that use them. So over here, this is our array basic program, but let's go ahead and look at a different one from the book. So this over here is LetterCount. And let me actually delete this off. I want this to be on one screen if I can get it there. So this is LetterCount. The purpose of LetterCount is over here. It reads a sentence from the user and counts the number of uppercase and lowercase letters contained in it. Before we actually go and read through this code, let's actually try running it and see what we get out. So over here, let's go and run this. See what we get. Okay, so first thing it does is it prompts us to enter a sentence. So let me just type in, this is a test. I'll press enter. So if we take a look at this, and let me maybe move my output around a little bit. Actually, maybe I should just go ahead and clear it. I've cleared it, so I'm going to have to rerun it, but it'll be a little easier for us to read stuff, so that's okay. So this is a test. And over here, right, we entered in this stuff here. And then what this program is doing is it's counting up how many times each letter, upper and lowercase, occurred. So over here, we can see that there weren't any uppercase A's or B's or C's, but there was a lowercase a. There wasn't a lowercase b, wasn't a lowercase c, lowercase d, there was a lowercase e. So we're just counting up how many times each of these letters occurred in our input string, right? So I occurred twice, S occurred 3 times, most of the uppercase ones, right, didn't occur at all, only T occurred. And at the end, right, there's also this other thing that says, okay, in addition to those letters, you had 4 non-alphabetic characters. In our case, right, that's going to be the spaces as well as a period at the end. So that's what this program does, right? It's counting up the different letters in a sentence. And the way this is implemented is, of course, using arrays. So let's jump over here and see how this thing is actually working. Up top, we have a familiar line of code. Import scanner, which is what we need because we want to read stuff. So looking down on my main, the first thing I have is this constant being declared. So again, this is kind of a best practice. We're trying to make something that's well engineered. We have this constant here called numchars. So what this is representing is the number of characters in the alphabet. So that is going to be initialized to 26. And we'll use that later when we're creating our arrays, right? Because what we're going to do is we're going to have an array that count the occurrences of uppercase letters, and then a second array to count the occurrences of lowercase letters. So this will be our size of those arrays. Looking down, our next line has this here, scanner equals new scanner, system.in. What this is doing is just creating a new scanner object. So this is exactly the same as we've seen before, right? Because we want our goal here, right, is to read in something from the user. So we need to create a scanner object to do that. Now we get to kind of the new stuff. So this is where we have kind of our main data being created. So over here, what we're doing is we're creating an array of integers called upper, right? Array of integers, name upper. And then we're going to create a new, an array object, right? That's kind of the syntax we need to use. So new int array, and it's going to store into there 26 things, right? 26 elements is how large that array is going to be. Because we want to count each letter, right? We want to have a separate count for each of the letters in our alphabet, and there's 26. Once we have that, right, we're going to have sort of this place we can count all the occurrences of the uppercase letters. But we want to do the same thing again for the lowercase letters, and that's what this next line here does. Again, we create an integer array. This time it's called lower. And then we're going to populate into it a new array of integers that contains 26 spaces, right? 26 slots that we can put numbers into, right? And that'll be my individual occurrences, right, for the different lowercase letters. So over here, right, these variables here are roughly corresponding to the 2 columns of numbers we see over here, right? Our uppercase and our lowercase occurrences, right, that we counted up, or we're going to count up. Next, we're going to declare a couple more variables. The first one over here, char current, what that's going to be is it's going to be a variable that's kind of our temporary storage, because we're going to loop over that string that we're reading from the user, and we're going to take out one character at a time. And that character, we're actually going to store it into this variable here, right, called current, right? So it's going to be our temporary holding space. The next thing we have here is an int other. So this is going to be our variable that's used to track the number of non-alphabetic characters that we see in our input, right? That was the last thing that our output showed us, right? It showed us the number of spaces, the number of dots, in general, right, the number of non-alphabetic characters that it saw. Over here, we don't need an array, right? Because we're just counting up one thing, right? We're counting up non-alphabetic characters. We're not counting, this is the number of space, the number of dots, the number of ampersands, the number of percent symbols. We don't have everything separated out, right? It's enough for us to have this one variable just says other, right? And everything will kind of get thrown in there at the same time. The only thing we're going to keep track of individually is the letters, right? All the different uppercase and lowercase letters. Because we have different things we want to keep track of, that's where we're going to need to have our array. Moving down, I have the portion of our program that interacts with the user. So here, I'm prompting the user, telling them to enter a sentence, and then I'm using that scanner object I built a minute ago to actually read it in. And then that line, that's going to be stored into the line variable over here that I'm also creating at the same time. At this point, right, once I'm at this line 23 here, right, I've set up my arrays, I've set up the count for other types of characters I may see, and I've also read in my data. So my kind of 2 steps remaining are, first of all, to go over that line, right, that string, and count up everything that's in there. And then once I've done the counting, I want to print out everything that I found. So how do I count up the stuff inside of this string? Well, first of all, what I'm going to need to do is have a loop, right? I want to be able to loop over every character in that input line, right? So every single character here, right? So initially I want to look at T, then H, then I, then S, then the space, then the I, then the S, and so on. Well, if I want to look at all those different things, really what I should think about doing is having a loop. And this loop, right, I'm going to have this variable here called ch. And what this is going to indicate is what is the current character I'm looking at, right? Initially, I'm going to look at character 0, right? The first character in that line that I read in. And then I'm going to keep on looping, right? Going up one at a time so that I can be sure that I'm looking at one character at a time. And I'm going to keep on doing that while ch, right? While ch is less than line.length, right? So this is similar to the array.length before, but over here, right, you'll notice that we have this open and close parentheses, right? Because this is actually a function being called to get the length of the string. Because strings, of course, work different than arrays do. So the purpose of this whole line here, right, is simply to loop over each character, right, or I should say the number of each character in that input string, right? So we're going to look at each of those in turn. But initially, I just have that number, right? I know that I'm looking at the 0th, or I should be looking at the 0th, the first, second character, right, in my input. But I don't actually have the character yet. And that's what this next line is actually doing. So over here, what we have is our current, right, that temporary variable we created earlier, and we're going current equal line.charat of ch, right? So we're saying, okay, for that thing that I read in, grab the chuth or the ch character, right, that particular one that's in there, right, grab that and store it into current. So we're just taking out a character. So at this point, we actually do have the character that was in the string, the input string, at that point. Now that we have that, we need to actually look at it and count up what we see. So what I have in here is an if statement. And this if statement, what it's going to do is it's going to check to see whether something is an uppercase letter, whether it's a lowercase number, or if it's something else. The first check we do in here is to see whether or not we're looking at an uppercase letter. Now, if you think back to a couple of chapters ago when we first introduced characters, you may remember that characters can actually be compared, right? So if we compare characters, it'll actually return true when they're in alphabetic order, right? So it's actually letting us check that fact, right? So we can actually use that here to check to see whether something is uppercase or lowercase, right? So over here, this first line, this is checking for uppercase. And the way it does that is it does that by checking to see whether current, right, the current character I'm looking at in my input string, whether that's equal to or greater than uppercase A, right? So is it an A or is it one of the letters that it's kind of after it, right? Is it uppercase B, uppercase C, uppercase D? So is it within that kind of start of the uppercase letters in that ASCII table, right? Remember that there's this table kind of in the back, right, that associates each character with a specific number, right? And it gives them all in order. So this is checking to see whether, is this the uppercase A or is it any of the characters that follow it? The second part here is doing kind of the same thing. It's checking to see whether current is either before or equal to the uppercase Z in that ASCII table, right? So is it that Z character, or is it one of the characters that come before it? Well, if we have both checks here, right, which is what we have, right? There's this and symbol going on here, right? We're doing the double and here, right? So both these things have to be true in order for this if statement to evaluate to be true. Well, given that I have both of those there, what it's doing is it's saying, if you're an A or something after it, or if you're a Z or something before it. Well, what that's doing is it's constraining that part of the ASCII table that we're looking at to just the uppercase A to Z letters, right? So we're kind of boxing ourselves in, so we're just looking at those 26 uppercase letters. So if this ends up being true, then we know we're looking at an uppercase letter. So let's say we have that. Well, in that case, what we'll do is we'll jump down here and update our array. Again, remember from when we first introduced chars, the chars actually map to integers, right? They all have these different indexes or IDs, right, in the ASCII table, right? So every character is really a number behind the scenes. Well, because of that, we can actually use them to figure out an index into an array. Right now, right, current is a char variable. It's whatever the uppercase letter we happen to find is, right? So initially it's going to be T. T is going to be some number, but it may be pretty large, right? It might be like 120 or something, right? It's going to be whatever it is in that ASCII table. This doesn't quite work for me though, because my arrays, right? My arrays over here that I want to count up stuff into, those arrays only go from 0 to 25. Well, maybe my T is some very large number in that ASCII table, right? So then I would get an outer bounds exception if I use that as an index into my array. That's not good. So what I'll do here is I'll use a little trick. I'm going to go current minus A, right? So this behind the scenes, even though I have this typed out as a character, when I have it like this, Java is going to convert this to an integer, right? The integer that represents an uppercase A behind the scenes. So what that's going to do, right, is essentially I have the number for T minus the number for A. So this will shift my number, right, this whole part here, right? This will be shifted to be a number between 0 and 25, right? Because A, right, is some number, right? Some number before whatever the thing is I'm looking at currently, right? So I'm subtracting that out, right? I'm shifting it back, right? So you can maybe imagine, hey, if this was a uppercase A, right, it would be A minus A. Well, A minus A is going to be 0, right? So that would store it into the first position in my array. If this was B, right, then B minus A, that'll actually end up giving me 1, right? Because whatever number A has associated with it in the ASCII table, that number is 1 after A, right? I don't really know where A is stored. I don't even know specifically where B is stored, right? What indices they should have, what numbers they have associated with them. But I know, right, that if I go minus A, I'm going to shift all my letters backwards, right? And so they're going to be shifted back, and so they're going to go from 0 to 25. That's very convenient because that is exactly what the indices in my array are going to be, right? So this is going to convert my ASCII indexes, right, my ASCII numbers for those uppercase letters into the indices within my array. So this is a pretty neat trick, maybe just something to keep in mind whenever you're managing characters, right? It's kind of cool here, right, that we didn't have to look up the indices for any of these letters, right? We're just able to do the subtraction here, and then everything works out in terms of our array. So let's say, right, this gets us to the proper position in our array. What we do once we're there is we do plus plus, right? So we want to increment up. Our goal was to count the number of occurrences of each of these letters. So we'll just go to whatever's there and increment it by 1, right? So if I had already seen 10 A's, well, I'd do plus plus, and I'd end up having 11 A's, right? I want to keep what's there and just increase it by 1. So plus plus will do that for us. So this bit of code here is going to count up the number of uppercase letters we see. And I guess maybe to go back for a second, the key thing that makes this work right is that initially all those arrays, those are going to initialize all of their compartments, right, all their indices to 0, right? Because that's how many things we've seen before we've processed the string, right? That's how it works out, right? Initially we've seen 0 of all of those letters, and then later, right, as this thing loops, we increment up the appropriate positions by 1, right? So counting up the number of occurrences. So this gets us our uppercase letters. What about the rest? Well, in that case, right, we're going to have an else branch, right? So if we're not an uppercase, then maybe we're a lowercase. And that's what this code here is checking. And this code here is working exactly the same as the if statement above. Again, we're checking to see whether current is greater than or equal to A and less than or equal to Z, right? So this is the code that's checking to see, is this a lowercase letter, right? Because is it in the specific area in the ASCII table? Well, if it is, then we can go to our array and update it. And again, we're doing the same thing here, right? We're saying, okay, current, whatever the thing is I'm looking at, minus A, right? So A, again, right, is kind of the start of the lowercase letters in the ASCII table. So doing the subtraction here is going to shift my lowercase letters, right, whatever they may be, right, whatever number is associated with them. It's going to shift them back so they start at 0. And they go from 0 up into 25. which again is exactly matching the array I created earlier. So once I have that shifting done, right, I can go to that specific slot in my array, right, the place that I want to count the occurrences of that particular letter, and I do my plus plus, right, to show that I have seen one additional letter for that index. Overall, these things work the same, right? They're checking to see whether something's upper or lowercase, and then they're incrementing the appropriate place in the appropriate array, right? This one over here is incrementing in upper. This one over here is incrementing in lower. The two different arrays we had created. But let's say this doesn't work out, right? Maybe I don't have an uppercase letter, and maybe I also don't have a lowercase letter. Well, in that case, things a little bit easier. I can just go and I can go other plus plus. Remember that other is a variable I have to count up the number of non-alphabetic things that I see, right? So I don't need to do any more logic at that point. I don't need to convert anything. I just do other plus plus to say, hey, yeah, I saw something that wasn't a letter. At this point, you can maybe picture in your mind that this thing will loop and loop and loop, right? It's going to look at each letter in turn, and based on whatever letter it sees, right, it's going to go to our array and increment the appropriate slot in the appropriate array by 1, right? Or if none of those work out, then it's going to increment other. So this runs, right, for every index. Eventually, we get to the end. There's nothing left for us to process. At that point, we want to actually print out our output. Well, how do we do that? Let's look over here at our output that we had from earlier. So what we have here is really 2 columns. And these columns, right, there's just 2 columns, and there's going to be 24 rows, right? Or 26 rows, right? So these things here, what we really want to do is you want to have an array that's going to go and print out each of these rows one at a time, right? So we're going to loop over both those arrays and print out one row, right, which means print out the frequency or the number of occurrences for first the uppercase and then the lowercase, right? And so that'll give us that nice table-looking thing there. And then at the end, right, we're going to print out that other variable, right, that counted up how many non-alphabetic characters we saw. So looking over here, first thing we have is this println line. This is just so we can have some spacing for between when the user typed in their sentence and then when we display the output. So it's just to make it look nice. Over here, this is kind of our main code. So this is going to be another loop, right? So here, we're going to be printing out each of these rows, right? The frequencies of upper and lower case. So I'll have my loop, right? A for loop. And in here, I'm going to have my iterator, my variable that changes. I'm going to call it letter. It's going to start at 0, right? And then it's going to go from 0, and it's going to go up one at a time. It's going to go until upper.length, right? So upper.length, right, this is really going to be 26 here, right? Because that upper array that I created, that had 26 slots into it, right? So this is going to be 26 here. Because it's less than, that means the letter is going to go up to 25. So this whole array is going to loop from letter equals 0 to letter equal 25, which is exactly what I want. Remember before we had some issues, right? We showed that things can go wrong, right? If we have the wrong bounds for our array. But in this case, right, our index, right, our letter variable here, it's going to be going kind of in the proper place, right, from 0 to 25. So we shouldn't have any issues. So let's go over here and let's look at our printouts. So over here, what we're going to do is we're first going to print out what is the particular letter that we're looking at, right, that we have the frequencies we want to show. So over here, what we have is we go to our letter, right, our index is changing, right, and we're going to go letter, initially it's 0, plus A, right? So this is another shift, right? So remember that we had to shift things to store them into the array. Here we're shifting in the other direction, right? So we're going from that number that was in the range 0 to 25, we're shifting it forward, right? Back into being the proper number, right? The proper character in that ASCII table. So once we've done that shift, right, and we're shifting here initially the index, right? Not what's inside, but the index itself. We shift it, we get back to A. B, C, D, E, and so on, right? So this bit of code here is displaying those uppercase letters over here. Once we have those displayed, then we can go and do our additional formatting to show the frequency. So over here on the next line, we have another print, and notice, right, there's not a print ln here, right? We have just a print, right? We don't want to have any kind of extra lines in there, right? We want this all to be displayed on one line until we get to the very end, and then we want to close it off. The first thing I'll do in here is print this kind of colon, a little delimiter, right, to show that there's this letter and then there's the frequency that comes after it. And then I'll do plus upper at letter, right? So upper was the array that contains the frequency or the number of occurrences, right, for each of the letters. And then we're saying, okay, go into the index letter, right? So initially it'll go into the letter of 0, right? The index that corresponds to the number of times we saw the uppercase A, right? So it'll go to that first slot there and return that value, right? Whatever it may be. In our example, it was 0. And so then that'll print out, right? Colon space 0. right? So this is the bit of our code, right, that reaches into our array and prints out the frequency, right, the occurrences associated with a particular letter. A similar thing happens below for the lowercase letters. So we have another print here. Here there's a couple tabs just to make our spacing a little bit nicer, right? Instead of having everything cramped up, we'll put them in two different columns. And then we do this thing again where we shift, right? We have to shift backwards, right? We have to go back from that 025. We need to move back to being the actual letters, right? Letters A, B, C, D. We need to shift back, right? So the way we do that, right, is just with the addition, right? Go letter plus A. So over here, maybe one thing to point out is that the first time this loop runs, letter is 0 over here, and it's also 0 over here. Well, it's also, here and here, right? It's 0 throughout. But over here, right, because we're adding different A's, right, because we're adding uppercase over here or lowercase over here, the letter that's being displayed will be different, right? So this shift here, right, it's not really having to change much. It's just going off of the fact that, the thing that's stored at index 0 in that array, that corresponds to A's, right? And then eventually, right, letter will go up and up and up, right? And then that will increment, right, what this ends up being, and it'll move up to be B, C, D, and E, right, as it kind of undoes that shift that we had done earlier. Once we display our lowercase a, or our lowercase letter in general, we can go over here and print out the actual frequency. So this line is the same as the one that we had for the uppercase, where we go and we do our colon, and then we go this time to the lower array, and then for that specific letter, right, at the letter index of 0 initially, right, and then counting up, print out whatever it is that you had stored there, right? Print out the frequency for that letter, right, the shifted letter. Once we have that, we'll have here our entire code that will print out our two columns here, right? So this is going to print out this nice output here. Our final touch is these last two lines here to print out the other characters. So we'll print out another line just to space things out, and then we'll have over here non-alphabetic characters plus other, right? So we'll print that little message and then the number of characters that we couldn't match up.